So you're sticking around, huh? Fair enough. I suppose when you wait half a year for videos, any video sounds like a good one. To be fair, set 10 isn't necessarily a bad set. In fact, you'll notice that there are a ton of cards for us to talk about in this set. The problem that it really has is that it's sandwiched in between two of Naruto's biggest turning points. Set 9 would be a complete overhaul of the mechanics and the way that not only playing Naruto, but building decks for Naruto would work. And then set 11 would give the game a revamped style that would stick with it until the very end of its life cycle. Despite having one or two really important cards come out in this set, it just can't compete with how important the other two sets are to the game. In fact, let's look at one of those influential cards now. But first, the introduction of a new set means we lose yet another set to the block format. And sadly, today it's Dream Legacy. A moment of silence for some of the awesome cards that were lost in Dream Legacy. This is Emina, and she is a client for everybody. Completely ignore her typings. She can be used in every single meta deck in the game, and if you are running a deck that did not already have a client, then this is the client that you would be using from this point on. Her effect lets you put 5 ninja cards from your discard pile back into your deck in order to draw one card. If you look at this like a competitive card game player, then this is essentially just getting to draw an extra card every turn during the late game. Of course, fire would get a little more use out of this than the other colors because fire could of course control the top cards of their decks stronger than the other elements could. There was still of course a little bit of pushback. This card wasn't appearing in everybody's deck, but it was appearing in most people's decks, especially decks that didn't already have a client. If you were running something like Emmy, it was definitely possible to continue running Emmy without running into Emina. And some players were also a little skeptical about throwing their turn 0s and turn 1s that would be clogging up their discard pile by now back into their deck and then potentially redrawing into them in the later stages of the game when really they'd want to be drawing into their better cards. But on the other side of that coin, you could more safely use your high cost ninjas, like your turn 5s and your turn 6s, as hand fodder for your mission cards, and then spend those cards as chakra more safely, and then Emina those cards back into your deck at later stages of the game. Overall, the card was a very powerful option at the time, but if you didn't choose to run it in your deck, there were definitely logical reasons why. The other most influential card in the set came from Water, so we'll go ahead and just look at Water now. Water Style Furious Current Jutsu was a very important card for the metagame at the time. You could pay 1 Water Chakra as well as X amount of Chakra in order to take one of your opponent's entrance cost X or less characters and put them back to the bottom of the deck. Something you have to understand is, unless you're playing a Toad deck, cards on the bottom of your deck are essentially removed from the game. They don't go back to your hand, so you can't just replay them immediately, and they don't go back into the top of your deck where you would be likely to draw back into them again. Unless you had cards that specifically got cards from the bottom of your deck, you pretty much were not going to be seeing those characters again. Going back to what I was saying about Emina, this is a fairly interesting double-edged sword, because if you were using it on your opponent's low-cost ninjas, let's say a turn 0, where you would have to pay 0 for X in order to get rid of that character, then It was essentially getting rid of one of the cards your opponent definitely wouldn't be needing in later stages of the game. However, because the card was such powerful removal, you could easily justify using this to get rid of a Naruto or a Sasuke, or potentially a different jutsu user who had a lower entrance cost. This was also a fairly decent counter to most mental decks because a lot of the great mental power ninja like Sakura and Shikamaru were fairly low entrance cost ninja. So at most you were only paying maybe 2 chakra in order to get rid of them for the rest of the game. In a pinch, you could justify paying 6 or 7 chakra to get rid of a boss monster as well, and even though that came with a higher cost, that also came with a higher reward. It's one thing to have a Naruto at the bottom of your deck, it's a completely other thing to have a 4th Hokage at the bottom of your deck. And of course, now that Emina was a thing, if you did happen to throw away a ton of your high entrance cost ninja, there was still a chance of recycling them back into your deck and then redrawing them. This card would become a no less than a 2 of in most water decks, but would eventually go on to be a mandatory 3 of as we started getting better and better 1 and 0 turn cost ninjas. State 2 was starting to get cycled out a little bit at this point, so there aren't too many State 2 centered cards that we have to look at, but we do have a couple. Clematis Dance Flower. Clematis. Clematis. I know that that's a totally innocuous word, but that's going straight up there with moist and splosh is just words that just sound so weird that I don't feel comfortable saying them, but let's continue. This is a Kimimaro State 2 jutsu, and it essentially worked like a Rasengan or a Chidori. Give a huge 5 power boost, and if you win a victory or an outstanding victory, you get a battle reward. If you were clinging on to the Kimimaro boss strategy, then you could use this to sneak a few more battle rewards away from your opponent. While it wasn't the most common thing in the world, there were starting to become an alarming amount of cards that let you win battle rewards outside of just attacking and not being blocked. And while you couldn't get all 10 of your battle rewards this way, you could get almost half of them, which was an interesting idea to play around at the time. I'm Coming to You was a lightning mission that let you select one in-play Kidomaru. Oops, I meant one in-play ninja. Who knows who you would have picked? When that ninja is sent out to attack this turn, then you select one of your opponent's ninjas, and if they decide to block, that is the only ninja that can be selected as that ninja's blocker for the turn. Needless to say, this made Kidomaru even more powerful than he already was. If you selected your Kidomaru and selected one of your opponent's chump blockers, then that chump blocker was the only thing that could come in and stop Kidomaru. They couldn't block with their best team. And then, when they did come in to block, all you had to do was drop a Spider Bow Fierce Rip and use Kidomaru's effect to start taking pot shots at your opponent's main team. In fact, in the way late stages of the game, you could even separate Kidomaru into his own team so that he can continue employing the strategy while you separated out your best ninjas into a brand new team of 3 ninjas and went out to attack with both. You could select your Kidomaru and even select your opponent's best team to make sure that your other teams could go out to attack safely. There was no guarantee that Kidomaru was going to live through it, but you could probably get a ton of stuff done during that turn if you were willing to sacrifice a Kidomaru to do it. Honestly, as tricky as this card was to use, there were a ton of really sneaky things you could do with it. It made it a much better water card than a lightning card. The Akatsuki were being built up as the new hot thing, so Itachi and Kisame would both get some love in this set. The Itachi-Kisame platoon was yet another card that would win battle rewards every time you dealt damage to your opponent's characters, even if they were sent out to block. While this card could of course be used for either an Itachi deck or a Kisame deck, it was definitely a little bit better for Kisame decks. Water already has cards that support this kind of battle strategy, and these stats are definitely a great thing to see in a water deck. But of course, don't let that stop you from using it in a fire deck as well. The main reason that this was so good in water decks is because Kisame not only got that awesome platoon that he could turn into to give him the better stats, but he also got Shark Skin. With Sharkskin's effect, you could pay one measly little water chakra to turn one of your opponent's ninjas into a zero combat ninja for that turn. If you pair that up with I'm Coming to You, then you could use this card to straight up assassinate one of your opponent's ninja. You just declare him for I'm Coming to You, and then declare one of your opponent's separated out meat puppets, and then once they go out to block you, you play this card to make that card a guaranteed zero, giving your Kisame Itachi a guaranteed victory over that card, and of course one battle reward. Visitors from the Darkness let you put a non-leaf ninja in play in addition to your regular deploy for the turn, which, of course, as you should well know by now, Water Ninja were mostly non-leaf ninja, so it was very easy to find targets for this in a water deck, a little bit less so in a fire deck. Speaking of that pesky leaf village, if your opponent did play ninja from the leaf, then you could steal one of them in the later stages of the game using Final Separation. Of course, in order to do this, you have to not already have that ninja in play on your side of the field, but this was a permanent way to steal one of your opponent's ninja, and in the later stages of the game, having 3 extra cards in your chakra area definitely isn't going to hurt you. For one last blow to the Leaf Village, we have Deep Ambition, in which every in-play Leaf Ninja gets -1/-1, giving most teams a -3 overall power. Once again, Itachi decks were normally using at least a few Leaf Ninja. You liked Kakashi, and you liked Sasuke at the very least. So Deep Ambition was really made for water decks to counter fire and lightning decks. And while rare, you could have multiple of these out at the same time to give teams even less power during your most crucial turns. The last trick up Kisame's sleeve is Ghost Panic. You may be wondering, why is Ghost Panic considered such a powerful card in a Kisame deck? Remember that platoon I showed you? Well, here it goes. If you play Ghost Panic on a discarded Kisame or Itachi, then you could keep them in play just long enough to platoon them into the Kisame Itachi platoon. This is a very common strategy to use for any platoon-heavy deck. Naruto and Gamabunta liked this, Shikasuma liked this, Inoichi liked this. They were all great for this, but this is most prevalent for Kisame Itachi because you could get rid of Kisame or Itachi early on in the game and then get them back with Ghost Panic in order to platoon into them and keep them in play permanently. Of course, you could steal something else, but keep in mind you're only going to get to keep that ninja for 2 turns, and if you don't figure out something to do with it, it's going right back in the discard pile. You may be saying to yourself right now, wait a second, isn't that just Call of the Haunted from Yu-Gi-Oh? Yeah, I mean it is. There's no getting around it. But trust me, this isn't the only time that you're gonna see the Naruto CCG cop a thing or two from the Yu-Gi-Oh card game. If you were playing something more of a generic water strategy, not really leaning into Akatsuki and not really leaning into State 2, then you did still have some options. There was a new mechanic introduced in the set called Wanted, where you could play one mission card like this one that would give an opponent's ninja the wanted status. But if you pair that up with Duel at OK Temple, then if that ninja would happen to be discarded for any reason or just removed from play altogether, then you would not only win one battle reward, but you would get to select any card from your discard pile and move that bad boy back to your hand. Winning a battle reward, that's cool, okay? That's okay. That works really well with our water strategy. But getting to select any card from your discard pile and put it back in your hand is nuts. That's way better than getting to draw a card. After losing some of their most iconic cards, as well as all of their summonings, the Sannin did get a little bit of love in this set, with some very powerful 5-turn cost but 2 hand cost cards. All of these effects would be contingent on you winning outstanding victories or getting outstanding battle rewards, but the effects would always be worth it, and the stats were nothing to scoff at either. You may also notice something very interesting about this Orochimaru card, in that it has growth. Meaning that if you have this card in play and you happen to get yet another Orochimaru in your hands, then you can play that Orochimaru for 1 less hand cost, and it comes in as a 7/5. At the end of the turn that this ninja's team gets an outstanding victory or an outstanding battle reward, then you can destroy one of your opponent's ninjas with the lowest entrance cost at the end of the turn. For the most part, you are just going to be getting rid of your opponent's low-cost turn 0, turn 1, turn 2 ninjas that they weren't going to be that attached to anymore, but keep in mind, each one of those cards represents a block that you get to make during the game. So if you start getting rid of those now, your opponent's eventually going to run out of those, and they're going to have less cards to block with as the game goes on, which is going to eventually become a pretty big problem. It works really well with itself because as your opponent starts losing blockers to this effect, they're going to be even less likely to have more blockers in the future, and Orochimaru's effect will go off more often. It's a sort of loop that leads to your opponent's demise. And hey, if the Kisame Itachi platoon's not really your thing, there was in fact an Orochimaru and Kabuto platoon that might just whet your palate. While its effect isn't anything too extraordinary, its stats are what you would get from growthing an Orochimaru into play. With enough mental power to rival the great Shikamaru, might I add. But when it did come into play, you could take the Kabuto or Orochimaru that you used for this effect and put it back in your hand. This makes the idea of paying 3 chakra to use one mission a little bit more palatable. Then, if for some reason this card is removed from play, this card goes back to your hand as well. So hypothetically, you could loop this Orochimaru and Kabuto using the Orochimaru or Kabuto that you got rid of for this card. As soon as this leaves play, you just replay the other card, and then you can put this card on top of it to get it back immediately. A 7-5 ninja's nothing to scoff at. A 7-5 ninja that you can never get rid of, that's another thing entirely. This was around the time of the Raiga filler, so the Kurosuke family did make an appearance within the card game, and they weren't bad. Let's take a look. Raiga may not be a Sannin, but he does have a Sannin level ability. If his team wins an outstanding victory or an outstanding battle reward for the turn, then you can get rid of all the ninja cards in your opponent's chakra area. This would unintentionally become a pretty important card in just a couple of sets, but for right now, it's just a decent way of cycling through your opponent's chakra. Maybe not the absolute best effect out there, but in the right situations, it could be pretty devastating. To make outstanding victories just a little bit easier to pull off, he also gets +2/+2 when you have Ranmaru in play. Ranmaru is a turn 0 ninja, so keeping it in play the entire game, especially with that water jutsu running around, is going to be a bit difficult, but it is worth it if you can pull it off. Your Raiga Kurosuke gets -1 entrance cost in hand, and the head ninja of this ninja's team can't be affected by your opponent's ninjas. This essentially meant that you could use this card to get around Kidomaru's bow. Keep in mind, you don't have to pair Ranmaru and Raiga up in order for Raiga to get the power boost. You just have to have Ranmaru in play. And even if you did pair them up, it's still giving you +2 to make up for the fact that Ranmaru's support is so bad, essentially giving Ranmaru 3 support in a roundabout kind of way. Plus, if you were worried about support ninja, you could run Kurosuke Gang. Uniquely, the Kurosuke Gang could be played even if you already had another Kurosuke Gang in play, and they gave each other a power buff. If you had one in play, it was just a 0-1, but if you had 2 in play, both of them were a 1-2, and if you could complete the trifecta, then all 3 of them were a 2-3. In the earlier stages of the Naruto meta, this would be almost unheard of, because turn 0 is already such an important slot that cards were fighting for already, but keep in mind, at this point in the Naruto metagame, if you were playing with a non-leaf deck, then your Sasuke was actually a turn 3 ninja, and your Shikamaru could easily be a turn 1 ninja. So, really you only had Naruto and Sakura who really needed to be turn 0s, and with the increase to deck sizes, there was some room to put 3 Kurosaki Gangs in your water deck. It also helped a little bit that their effects are valid, meaning that even if you happen to play one early and you have to use it as a blocker, you could still have it damaged and get the exact same amount of value out of having it. Now, if you were okay with using a filthy leaf ninja, then you did have access to a second Hokage. During the mission phase, you could get rid of as much water chakra as you wanted in order to give one of your opponent's ninjas minus X power equal to the amount of chakra that you got rid of. Now, the neat thing about this is then at the end of the turn, you could put the exact same amount of cards back into your chakra area so that you're not actually losing anything. You could look at it as a free weaken ability that worked as a sort of comeback mechanic if you weren't keeping up with your opponent in the jutsu area. And since you could specifically choose which cards were going back into your chakra area and which cards were staying in your discard pile area, it made cards like Emina easier to play around. The last card we're going to look at in water is a new Giant Vortex Jutsu. Of course, they were going to release a new one to replace the one that we lost in set 1. This one's interesting, though. You could argue that it's a little bit better, and you could also argue that it's a little bit worse because you have to be a bit trickier in order to get its full value. With this Giant Vortex Jutsu, it does essentially the exact same thing that Path to Hokage Vortex did, but you couldn't use it on the team that you are battling against. You had to use it on a team of standby ninja. If your deck was utilizing I'm Coming For You, then you could sort of cheat your way around using this by making one of your opponent's non-important ninja come out to block you, and then Giant Vortex Jutsuing their standby goods team. And even 10 sets later, losing 3 ninja in one turn is fairly devastating for just about any deck out there. And this is especially bad if you are also running the Orochimaru that also kills a ninja every turn if it's winning outstanding victories or getting outstanding battle rewards. Because at that point, your opponent's ninja count isn't going up ever again. Every time they drop a ninja, they're going to lose a ninja, and eventually it's going to lead to them just not being able to keep up with you, and them losing the game. Luckily, Bandai kinda sorta saw this coming, so if your opponent does just let an attack go through, you can't just cheese them by using Giant Vortex Jutsu and getting rid of one of their other standby teams. Your team does actually have to be blocked for Vortex to go off. Some pretty interesting things were happening within Fire at the time, so let's take a look at that next. We may have lost the true heir to the Sharingan, but Formidable Visual Jutsu was a pretty decent replacement. When he comes into play, you can injure one of your opponent's ninjas, and as long as this ninja's in play, that ninja's not getting healed. The not getting healed thing is pretty situational, but if your opponent's not expecting you to drop this, then you can make your opponent's field pretty awful over the course of one card. Injuring a decent character whose effect is invalid, or just injuring a character to make them lose a crap ton of stats is going to be a turn where you're going to get some battle rewards. As good as this card is, do keep in mind, though, that your opponent can very easily play around this by just platooning the character that you put in injured status. So, make sure that you're playing around that, and this character is pretty Gucci. There was an interesting new development in the Itachi/Sharingan deck strategy, where it was no longer necessarily about having Sharingan Eye, it was more about having the Genjutsu combat attribute. Combat attributes were admittedly a very underutilized thing within the Naruto card game. Really, it only mattered if you had taijutsu or weapon for very specific deck types, but now Genjutsu was another thing you had to watch out for because Sharingan Ninja were going to have Genjutsu and they were going to get benefits from it. Kakashi dodged around every single jutsu your opponent played, unless it just so happened to be played by a Genjutsu user. So in the mirror match, this was almost useless, but if you were playing against something like a Gata deck, then Gata pretty much just couldn't touch Kakashi at all. You pair that up with Kakashi having 3 mental power, and he was quite the beefy boss monster. Kurenai may not have been a Sharingan-Eye ninja, but she did benefit from being a Genjutsu ninja, so they did end up incorporating her into the strategy. I guess let's get the obvious joke out there. It's funny that they gave her 1 mental power when she was dumb enough to use a Genjutsu on Itachi. Kurenai's effect gave every ninja in the battle involving her -1/-1 unless they happen to be a Genjutsu ninja. For the 2 most popular decks at the time, State 2 and Gata over 9000, this was pretty much a guaranteed -3 team power on your opponent's side of the board. And if you pair this up with the fact that you have a Kakashi who isn't affected by any jutsus, this made Fire a pretty good contender for the 2 most popular decks at the time. And of course, Kurenai always comes in with that 3 support, so she's definitely not a bad thing to have in your team. Sasuke, for some reason, comes in and ruins everything by just not having the Genjutsu combat attribute, so you can't use this Sasuke if you're going to be using the Genjutsu strategy. As for Sasuke's effect, how do I explain this? When you were a kid playing superheroes with your friends, did you ever have that one friend who basically invented an everything proof shields that couldn't affect them no matter what you did because they always had a reason why it wouldn't work? That's essentially Sasuke. He ain't affected by jutsu, he ain't affected by missions, he ain't affected by clients, and he sure as heck ain't affected by ninjas. So he wasn't affected by anything besides straight up beating him in a fight. Of course, to somewhat limit this ability, you did have to lose the top 2 cards of your deck every single turn unless you had the Final Valley mission in play, but even if you did have to pay those 2 cards every turn, having Amina sort of fix that a little bit. This is also kind of a weird situation where Sasuke gets to be both a Leaf Ninja and a Rogue Ninja at the same time, and sure, why not, he's also a State 2 ninja, so he can be used in State 2 strategies. Sasuke is kind of just an awkward mishmash of everything that was seen as a good card at the time. He got to be State 2, and Rogue Ninja, and Leaf, and he was a turn 4 who had 6 combat power, and he wasn't affected by any of your opponent's effects. So, I think somebody had a little bit of a crush on Sasuke when they made this card, but I digress. If you happen to be running a Leaf deck, then honestly, Third Hokage was kind of your guy. When he comes into play, he puts 1 growth coin on all of your in-play Leaf Ninja, and keep in mind, there are very, very, very few stipulations on this. Ninjas that already have growth coins aren't supposed to be able to be growthed anymore, but with the third Hokage, they can have another growth coin. Characters like Asuma, Kurenai, and Kakashi, who normally cannot be growthed into play, well, they get growth coins too. And hey, if you do happen to get the third Hokage back in your hand, you can play him again to spread even more love. You can't even really beat him in mental power because he also comes into play with 3 mental power, just like Kakashi. Sharingan-Eye users got a pretty interesting jutsu in Counter by the Sharingan-Eye, where when you played it, you could basically pay the cost of your opponent's buff jutsu, things like Rasengan, things like Chidori, and then you got to be the user of that jutsu instead of your opponent. This also meant you were technically paying more for it, but in a lot of cases, if you throw your opponent off by playing this card, you're probably going to get a little more value out of it than just having to pay 1 extra chakra. Kakashi also got himself a brand new Lightning Blade, and this is probably the best Lightning Blade yet. You can either use it to give Kakashi +7/+0 for the turn, just like with a Rasengan, or you can use it to negate and discard 1 jutsu being played, so it doesn't even get to go to the chakra area anymore. 3 was kind of a heavy cost to pay for an effect like this, but the fact that you could choose one or the other made the versatility worth the extra jutsu cost. For something a little bit more offensive, we had Dragon Flame Jutsu, which could be used by any special Jonin or higher ninja. 1 ninja battling against you gets 2 damage, and if they happen to be a higher entrance cost turn than you, then you could give them 1 damage instead. Keep in mind that for at least 1 more set, you have access to a Shikamaru that turns your opponent's head ninja into a 0 turn cost ninja, meaning that your opponent's head ninja was going to die if you played this using Shikamaru as your back ninja. The last teeny tiny thing we'll look at is Bite. If you use it with a ninja dog, then you can take one of your opponent's ninjas and have them use their injured combat stats instead of their healthy combat stats, as well as negating that ninja's effect. Of course, having your opponent use their injured stats instead of their healthy stats was it was pretty okay, but the main thing was getting rid of one of your opponent's effects. Now that Naruto was full on embracing the idea of archetype decks, they had cards starting to come out that specifically rewarded you for playing fully into an archetype. World of Genjutsu made it so your opponent just straight up could not use any of the best jutsu in the game for the next 2 turns. Any non-Genjutsu ninja cannot be the user of a jutsu card that has 2 or more specific symbols in it. So Spider Bow Fierce Rip is totally out. Rasengan is totally out. Heck, even things like that Dragon Flame Jutsu that we just looked at is totally out. If you dropped this on turn 4, it gave you a huge advantage for the next 2 turns, and if you could manage to drop it again once this one expired, then your opponent was probably going to scoop up the game. Also, don't think I didn't notice, okay? I noticed that the Hizashi picture was recycled. This is some pretty lazy stuff. It's literally a sunburst in the background with true heir to the Sharingan Itachi, Sharingan versus Sharingan Kakashi, and reliable comrade Kurenai, okay? Ya ain't slick. If you were playing around the third Hokage strategy of Leaf Ninja getting a ton of growth coins, and you also had access to Youths of the Land of Fire, where every time you deployed a Leaf Ninja, it got 1 growth coin. This was a pretty awesome way to get turn count for Sasuke to be a 7-head ninja. This is a pretty awesome way to get turn for Sasuke to be a 7-power head ninja. And like I stated before, even if you do happen to give your ninjas the 1 growth coin with this effect, they still get the 1 growth coin from the third Hokage coming into play, and there's really no limit to the amount of growth coins that you can get out of using these effects. Plus, characters like Kakashi and Kurenai, who normally can't get growth coins other ways, can get a growth coin through this effect. If you're not using a third Hokage Leaf strategy, then you still got some pretty awesome stuff. Threat of the Akatsuki gives all of your in-play Akatsuki Ninja +1/+1, as well as your opponents, keep that in mind. Plus, Akatsuki Ninjas cannot be affected by the effects of your opponent's Jutsu cards. So not only is your Kakashi safe from those pesky Jutsu, but your Itachi is as well. Symbol of the Rogue Ninja was a great way to start ending the game, winding it down a little bit, as they say, in the later stages of the game. With a turn cost of 7 and a hand cost of 2, you could search your deck for any Rogue Ninja and put it in play. Keep in mind, this also counts for platoons, so if you did happen to have your Itachi or Kisame in play, then you could get the Itachi Kisame platoon out of your deck and put it directly in play on top of that other Itachi or Kisame. But it was just as good for just getting some kind of ninja in play that you don't have already or that was recently killed. So if you need another Zabuza, it's there. If you need another Kisame, it's there. Secret Activities was just a straight up draw 2 cards effect. It's interesting because this is a straight up -1 to your hands, but it is also putting 3 cards in your chakra area. So if you were using a very heavy jutsu strategy like a lightning blade spam or something, this is a great card to get some extra cards into your hand and your chakra area simultaneously. I guess somebody over at Bandai noticed that Fire hadn't been the best deck in the game in like 5 minutes, so they decided to also give Fire a bunch of cards that let them counter things going on within the metagame at the time. Curse Ceiling was an extremely easy way to just get rid of Kidomaru's effect for 3 turns, or get rid of Power of State 2's effect if they happen to be using that. It was also great in the mirror match if you happen to need to get rid of your opponent's Whirl of Genjutsu, or something along those lines. Can't keep up with those mental power decks? Well, how about a card that just gets rid of all mental power battles for 2 turns? And of course, we have the totally innocuous self-sacrifice permanent mission card that says that if any of your ninjas receive damage by an effect or a jutsu card, then you can put this card in the chakra area to negate that damage. I wonder what popular ninja card at the time dealt damage to ninjas, but also had a jutsu that dealt a lot of damage to ninjas. Sniff, sniff, sniff. Is that bias I smell? We'll end this animosity on a slightly more fun card in Cooking Match. Despite being what I think is a fairly interesting shakeup to the game, I do understand that this card is a lot more casual than what I normally look at. Your opponent picks any number between 1 and 9, and then you have to see if you can match up the entrance cost of cards in your hand to the number that your opponent selected. If you can pull this off, then you win battle rewards equal to the number of cards that you reveal for this effect. So there is a decent chance that you're just not going to get anything off of this, but there's also a fairly decent chance that you're going to get like 3 or 4 battle rewards in 1 turn out of this. So despite being a quote-unquote casual card, because it's not really one of those things you can rely on to win you the game, when and if it does pop off, it pops off, and it's an interesting mind game with your opponent, because if they pick a really low number, then it's more likely you'll be able to do it, but you're also going to get less cards out of it. But if your opponent picks a really high number, then there's less of a chance that you'll be able to pull that off, but when you do, you're going to be getting like 5 battle rewards at a time. You could also cheese this a little bit by just putting down turn 0 count ninjas, because those can be added with no problem and they don't add anything to the actual number you're trying to hit. So, yes, I enjoyed using Cooking Match, okay? I'm sorry for having a little bit of fun in this card game, but if you also wanted to get a little bit of enjoyment out of Fire, then this was the best way to do it. Fire was also playing around with this deck type around Temujin, who's a character from one of the movies, and you'll notice he doesn't have a shuriken for his turn cost because he's not a ninja. Even though it says ninja up there, but let's completely ignore that. This character, once again, cannot be affected by your opponent's effects and also doesn't receive damage from jutsu cards. How fitting. He was a little bit easier to stomach playing because they also gave you a mission card that let you just directly play him from your hand without taking up your deploy for the turn. And if you wanted to be a super crazy guy, then he had his own version of Chidori essentially in Rising Thunder. +5, +0, and if your team wins a victory or an outstanding victory, give 1 additional damage to every ninja battling against you for the turn. Oh, Banda, you sneaky, sneaky dogs. If you wanted to go a little bit less meta, then you could also use the magic combat attribute characters, and even though the characters themselves aren't really worth looking at, their jutsu are fairly interesting. Plasma Ball lets you pay 2 chakra, and you got not only +3/+3 for the turn, but you also couldn't receive any damage. Illusion was an easy way to give one of your opponent's ninjas -3/-3 for the turn at a much discounted cost. And a regular attack was a fairly interesting thing to work around because both teams would have to use the opposite team power that they normally would. Let me explain. The head ninja uses their support value instead of their combat value, and each back ninja uses their combat value instead of their support value. On its own, that's pretty garbage, but the fact that each of your jutsu affects both the combat and the support makes this a pretty decent thing to play around if you wanted to build a deck that specifically had ninja that had both combat stats pretty decent. Since we're kind of already talking about Earth anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at Earth next. Mental Power got a pretty interesting client in Kome, who, for the cost of him and 1 chakra, made every single team do a mental power battle for the turn, which, I don't need to tell you, is devastating. On top of that, because he got rid of himself for this effect, you could play multiple Kome in your deck and still be okay. Weapon decks also got a pretty interesting tool. You see what I did there? In the new 1010. When this 1010 went out to battle, you could get a jutsu with a cost of 1 or 2 colorless in your discard pile and put it in your hand every single turn. There were already some pretty decent cards that this paired up with in the metagame already, but 1010 also got her own jutsu to go alongside this. Iron Chain could be used by a weapon combat attribute to give a ninja -2/-2 for the turn and also negate its effects text. Unfortunately, the timing on this was way too late to really affect your Kidomarus and Gatas that you'd be fighting against, but it was pretty decent against Genjutsu decks that were starting to pop up because you could get rid of Kakashi's effect as well as Itachi's. But let's stop playing around, okay? The real reason that you would want to play Earth is one of two. Either you're here for mental power, or you're here for the Hyuga clan. Just like most of the other great archetypes, Hyuga clan was starting to get even more great platoons in this set. Hanabi Hiyashi came out and said, if you do not block my team, you will have to discard a card from your hand. By itself, this isn't necessarily a great effect, but if you pair this up with everything else that was going on at the time, then this is pretty good. Wanted poster with a reward was either draw 2 cards if it was turn marker 4 or 5, or get rid of 1 card from your opponent's hand if it was turn 6 or more. Nagare punished your opponent for spamming jutsus pretty early on, because every time they play a jutsu, they must also discard 1 card from their hand. Toki's effect, of course, also worked really well with the Hyuga clan because, once again, if they happen to get a battle reward or an outstanding battle reward, your opponent had to discard a card from their hand, just like with the platoon's effect. And Princess Dusk, a personal favorite card of mine, said that every time they went out to battle, each player had to take one card from their hand or their chakra area and discard it. All of this came together to make the Hyugas constantly get rid of your opponent's hand strategy much, much, much easier to perform. And when you pair that up with Tamari, who not only has great stats, but also has the effect that you can just discard a chakra during your mission phase to look at your opponent's hand whenever you wanted, was pretty great. Hyuga also got access to a couple of pretty decent jutsu cards. Let's go ahead and take a look at Gentle Fist first. Gentle Fist gives your Byakugan ninja a +2/+2 for the turn, and if it's at least 3 turns into the game, then your opponent also loses 2 of their chakra. A new 64 Palms was also out, usable by either Neji or any Byakugan ninja with an entrance cost of 4 or more. That was great anti-meta at the time, because you could look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck, get rid of all of the jutsus, and then shuffle the rest back into their deck. You were always going to get at least a little bit of value out of this, because every deck was running at the very least 8 jutsu, even if they weren't the big Rasengan, Chidori, Fierce Rip type. Stepping outside of the Hyuga clan for a second, we ended up getting a first Hokage to go along with our second Hokage that we got in Water. As long as he's in play, every time your opponent puts a ninja in play, they can't pair that ninja up in any teams until their next turn. That ninja also can't be sent out to battle by itself, so it made it a fairly useless ninja. At this point in the game, you may be thinking, actually, that's pretty okay. I don't care if I have to wait a turn. I've already got an established field, and I can probably play around that pretty easily. But keep in mind that putting a ninja in play does not just mean deploying a ninja. It also means platooning a ninja, and another mechanic that we will be looking at in just a couple of sets. Where there is light, there is darkness. Where there is yin, there is yang. And where there is Temujin, there is Haido. Despite being kind of a throwaway character, he was a really awkwardly good character, because when he comes into play, at the end of that turn, you can search your deck for a Haido transformed and show it to your opponent and then put it in your hands. But I mean, Kudo, how good could this Haido transformation actually be? I mean, this is a filler set of cards after all. It's based on a movie. Do I really want to be putting this guy in my deck? Yeah. Yeah, he's pretty good. You can put this card in play by getting rid of your in-play Haido and putting this in play in its place. He's a turn 2 5/4 with 2 mental power, and that's pretty insane stats to have access to on turn 2. Sure, he's a 0/0 when he's injured, but his effect also is a self-heal that lets you heal him by just discarding a card from your hand. So ridiculous as this guy is, yes, he did see some play. The last card we'll look at in Earth is Clear Sky. Keep in mind, this is also fairly decent for water decks, but it's more Earth suited. You pick one player, and that player takes every card in their chakra area and discard pile and puts it back in their deck and shuffles. There are 2 ways you can look at this card. Either you use it on yourself, and it's great because you can take all the cards in your chakra area, discard pile, put them back in your deck, and then redraw into them later. Or you can use it on your opponent so that they, for sure, have 0 chakra to work with for that turn, and you can attack into them safely. While that is the more obvious use for this card, you shouldn't discount how good it was to get all the cards in your discard pile back into your deck, especially if you were playing around a strategy that allowed you to draw a ton of cards. This also meant that you could get all of the benefits of Emina without actually running Emina in your deck. It would be better at that point to just run Emi or Kome. Since we've already looked at it in the past video, let's go ahead and start off Lightning with Gamakichi and Gamatatsu, who let you, every single turn, look at the bottom 5 cards of your deck and put a Gamabunta in play. If you were running a Gamabunta-centered strategy, chances are you are going to run 3 Gamabunta to make this as easy to pull off as possible. Of course, having the insane luck of getting not only a Gamakichi or a Gamatatsu in your hand, but also getting the platoon in your hand on turn 0 was a little bit insane. Probably wasn't going to happen too often, but when it does, you were essentially getting a Gamabunta in play on turn 1 for essentially nothing. I'm also going to point out once again, it does not say deploy Gamabunta, so not only do you not lose your deploy for the turn, but you can use this on a Gamabunta who is in a platoon. Of course, with that turn 4 Sasuke, we also got ourselves a turn 3 Naruto, this one coming with a hand cost, who is also unaffected by your opponent's effects. Isaribi worked really well with Toads because you were already checking the bottom card of your deck to see if it was a ninja card. So since you were already running that strategy, you were able to sort of work around it even better by getting even more value from Isaribi's effect. Of course, you could run this card in just about any deck and get some value out of it. I mean, ninjas make up a majority of every single person's deck, so the bottom card of your deck being a ninja isn't too crazy, but if you were playing a strategy that specifically manipulated your deck to have ninja at the bottom, then her effect was just nuts. Of all the platoons to come out and actually matter, I certainly didn't see this one coming, but Izumo and Kotetsu, the two bros from the Chunin exams, actually ended up getting a pretty decent platoon as well. At the end of each of your turns, you could draw one card and then put one card from your hand in the chakra area, filling up not only your hand but also your chakra area at the same time. This was predictably pretty important if you were running a strategy around Rasengan or Chidori because you needed that chakra area to be full as early as possible. 3 support and 2 mental power is also nothing to scoff at. Of course, our Lightning Sanin also got himself a growth card in a turn 5 2-hand cost eccentric man of the village. Win an outstanding victory or an outstanding battle reward, and you can look at your opponent's hand and discard one card that you see. Man, if it weren't for that 2-hand cost, this would be an amazing thing to throw into that Hyuga strategy. But of course, since Lightning doesn't really have anything within it that counters Jutsus very effectively, this is really the best Jutsu removal you're gonna get. Because if you can just discard cards from your opponent's hand, and those cards happen to be Jutsu that would counter your strategies, then, I mean, that's pretty much the best you're gonna get as far as Jutsu removal. And that's not even to discount how good this is to just get rid of missions or ninjas that you see that are also going to be a problem. Since this Jiraiya comes out on turn 5, you can use it to get rid of your opponent's turn 6 and turn 7 entrance cost ninjas, or even of their turn 5 cost ninjas if you have to be playing first. And of course, we saved the best ninja for last, the 4th Hokage. Jesus, this character, man. When you win a battle reward, whether it's a regular battle reward or an outstanding battle reward, you get one more battle reward than you would normally get. Okay, no problem. I'll just send out a chump blocker every turn to block his effect. Wrongo, friends! If he's injured, then you cannot block him with a team that only has one ninja in it. So you're either going to be sacrificing 2 chump blockers at a time to block his effect, or you're gonna have to block him with your main team, allowing the other teams to go through and get even more battle rewards. You also can't cheese him with mental power because this just so happens to be one of the only lightning ninja in existence who's allowed to have mental power. If this card had come out for any other elements, I think I'd be a little bit upset about it, but honestly, Lightning kind of needed something like this, and I think this is an awesome finisher for Lightning to have. You probably already noticed, I probably don't need to say it, but doesn't hurt that he has 4 support when he's healthy and 5 support when he's injured. On to Jutsu, Naruto got himself a card called Released Power, where you could give him plus X plus 0 for the turn, where X was the number of your turn marker. Couple of really neat things about this card. One, it's just a Naruto that you have in play, so you don't really need to have like Oil Combat Attribute or any specific Naruto. And it also works for any platoon that includes Naruto in it. In the earlier stages of the game, you don't really want to be paying 2 chakra to get like 3 or 4 power. But if the game goes on long enough and you can get 8 or 9 power out of this by paying that 2 chakra, dang, that's kind of a lot. It might be worth it at that point. Gamabunta also got himself a brand new Toad Sword that straight up gives 1 damage to a ninja, and this jutsu card cannot be negated, so Lightning Blade's not going to be getting rid of this one. On to mission cards, if you are just all in on this Toad strategy thing, then they gave you a mission to make it even easier to pull this strategy off. On turn 0, you can play a mission that lets you search your deck for a Gamatatsu or Gamatichi ninja card and put it into play. Now, I know I've said it like 3 or 4 times now, but This does not mean deploy, so not only does it not take up your deploy for the turn, but if you already have Gamatatsu or Gamakichi in play, you can use this to get the platoon and put the platoon in play instead. Weight training was a surprising amount of strategy to come out in Lightning. I don't want to be offensive here, but Lightning is very, very straightforward in the way it plays the game, but weight training was a very interesting trick. You could give weight training to one ninja, and that ninja is -3/-3 while this card is in play. So you could hypothetically use it on one of your opponent's ninjas to make them a -3 power and make it easier to attack into them, which at the later stages of the game is actually pretty deadly, because if your opponent can't check your 4th Hokage for 2 turns, that's basically game. Lightning really doesn't have very much in the way of good support ninja, so if you play this early on, then in the later stages of the game, you can kind of fill that gap in power that you normally have with your opponent by having a ninja with a decent amount of support that you can throw into a team. So yeah, tricky card this one. It's good both offensively and defensively, and there's a lot of nuance in when and why you should use it. If you are planning on running the Sanin that require 2 cards from your hand in order to play, then Origin of the Legend does make it a little teeny tiny bit easier, because not only does it make their hand cost 0 so that they can just come into play without having to pay anything for them, but it also gives every single Sanin card in your hand growth if it did not have growth originally. Now, I'm still going to argue that the turn 5 Sanin are good enough that you don't need to be playing another Sanin on top of them, but if that's what you really want to do, this makes it easier to do. Something that I find interesting is Tsunade gets pretty screwed in this whole arrangement, because she's arguably the one who has the best ninja cards and would benefit the most from this kind of effect, but this isn't a wind card, so you do have to splash something else into your deck if you want to use this with a Tsunade strategy. Box Lunch is fairly simple. You can use it to get one card from your chakra area or your discard pile back into your hand. If you were using this in a jutsu-heavy deck, then this meant that you could recycle a jutsu very quickly, or if you had to get rid of a jutsu early on for maybe a hand cost, then it's an easy way to get that card back into your hand without worrying about it too much. The last card I want to look at here is one of the most interesting anti-meta cards that I think I've seen in just about any card game. Perfect Disguise could be used on a non-platoon ninja to give that ninja guy within its name. As the example states, if you use this on a Naruto Uzumaki, then it turns that character into Naruto Uzumaki Guy. This had some very interesting ramifications. So, for one, this let you play multiple of the same ninja at the same time, because if your Naruto Uzumaki is now called Naruto Uzumaki Guy, then his name technically isn't Naruto Uzumaki anymore, so you can have another Naruto in play. If you use it on one of your opponent's ninjas, like Kisame for example, then his name is now Kisame Hoshigaki Guy, not Kisame Hoshigaki, which is what his name would need to be in order to turn into the platoon. But the absolute funniest thing about this card is if you use it on one of your opponent's ninjas, then that ninja can no longer use their own jutsu cards. You can't use Lightning Blade with that character. That Lightning Blade has to be used by a character named Kakashi Hatake, not Kakashi Hatake Guy, silly. It's the perfect crime. Not only can they not use their own jutsu, but they can't even platoon to get out of this lock because they can't platoon into anything that would require their original name to work. Speaking of which, the Lee strategy didn't get very much love in this set, but it did get one very unique card in Sonic Speed Attack, which was a tool for Might Guy. For the cost of one measly lightning chakra, you can either injure a healthy ninja, or take an injured ninja and put it in the discard pile. This may sound very awkwardly worded, but it was very important that it be worded exactly the way that it is on the card, because this got around all of those stupid, this card cannot be damaged by your opponent's effects cards that were going around at the time. This card doesn't deal any damage, it changes status. either changing healthy status to injured status, or straight up putting that card in the discard pile without ever dealing any damage to it. If this card happens to cost 2 chakra, this probably wouldn't be worth it. But the fact that it costs only 1 chakra to get around these effects makes it decent enough that you would at least put it in your sideboard. Okay, well, let's take a look at our last element, Wind, and see what Gato was up to. The reason we're looking at Wind last is Wind really didn't get very much that was that impressive in this set, especially if you were focused on the Gato strategy. I mean, fair enough, they've gotten quite a lot already, but they really don't have a lot for us to look at here. But let's go ahead and start with Shukaku. Shukaku's fairly interesting, because one of two things has to happen for you to really get use out of this effect. Either you have to be very, very just against the meta and not doing Gara over 9,000, or it has to be late enough in the game that you've already gone through all of your Gato jutsus and you don't really have a great way of getting them back, so you might as well just not do that strategy anymore. Shukaku's name is Gata of the Desert, so you can't have both him and Gata in at the same time. His hand cost is pretty ridiculous at being 2, especially considering you're going to have to get rid of it for Shukaku's effect anyway, but it is a great way of countering your opponent's strategy if your opponent still has jutsu they can play. Neither player gets any chakra, and you basically have to win your battles through sheer power. Again, it's kind of a weird thing to throw at Gata, because it doesn't really do anything to enhance Gata's current playstyle, but it does give you a new playstyle if for some reason you're not into the whole Gata spamming jutsu thing. If you are going to be doing that, there's a pretty interesting anti-meta card called Naruto Uzumaki Unfit to be a Team Leader, in which you can make it so that every time a player has to flip a Ninja Blade coin, it's going to be tails regardless of what the regular result would be. This counters your opponent's Kidomaru, but guarantees that your double sand blades will be a kill. Now, if you were rocking a more traditional Gata strategy, then I do want to throw I'm Coming to You just out there again real quick, because again, I'm Coming to You is a great way of making sure your opponent has to eat your jutsu. So if you do happen to play it on your Gata and force your opponent to block with one of their maybe injured meat puppets that's sitting there in the back somewhere, then you can have them block and then use cards like Double Sandblade to start just taking pot shots at their main team. Use of the Land of Wind was the counter to, of course, Use of the Land of Fire, and works exactly the same way, but with Sand Ninja. Now, of course, you're not going to be having Big Daddy 3rd Hokage coming into play and giving everybody even more growth coins, but this is still a decent way of generating some growth coins on ninjas that normally wouldn't get any. At first, Under a Starry Sky might seem like a fairly interesting choice to put here, since it specifically works with Leaf Genin, but because your Gata strategy relies on you having specific cards on the top of your deck, this is actually much better in a Gata strategy than it is anything else, and chances are your early game is going to be having Naruto, Sasuke, Shikamaru, and the like. The way it works is you take any of your Gata jutsu in your discard pile and you put them back on top of your deck. And then when you play the Gata that lets you search the top 5 cards of your deck for a jutsu and then put it in your hand, you're guaranteed to have a decent target. If you were cheesing your opponent out with something like I'm Coming to You, then something like Organizing Teams is also something interesting you can play around. It's a very simple effect. During your opponent's turn, you can reorganize your teams, and since it happens at the beginning of the battle phase, it only happens after your opponent declares that they're done organizing their teams. So no matter how your opponent has their teams set up, you can counter their strategy by doing something different with your side of the field. Again, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't necessarily say this is the best effect out there, but if you pair this up with I'm Coming to You to do some sort of cheesy strats, then afterwards you can still reorganize your teams and not be punished for doing weird things with I'm Coming to You. This also got around a lot of meta cards that, for example, would say that a ninja can't be sent out to battle that would normally stop you from sending out an entire team of ninja, because you could just easily remove the ninja that can't go out to battle and then replace them with something decent. Overall, a very underrated card, but most of the players that knew what's up at least put 2 in their sideboard because it did have a lot of impact on the game. Wind was starting to do this thing with turn markers, and this is sort of the start of it. Cursed Samurai in white made it so your opponent didn't move up their turn marker at the end of their turn, which, dang. That's, if you're turn marker 3 and your opponent's playing on turn marker 3 as well, and then they don't move up and you do move up, then they're 3 and you're 4, they're 4 and you're 5, so on and so forth for the rest of the game. Dang. that has some ramifications on the rest of the game that are not immediately apparent, but especially if you pull off like 2 of these within the same game, you're probably gonna have a bit of an advantage over your opponent. On top of that, we also got Flying into the New Era. It's a counter permanent that let you move your turn marker up at the beginning of your turn instead of the end of your turn. Dang. That's also really, really good. I know that doesn't sound like much, but hear me out, okay? At the end of your turn, you move from 3 to 4. Then, on your opponent's turn, they take their turn, and you play Flying into the New Era. Then at the beginning of your turn, you move up to turn 5. So your opponent's playing on turn 3 or 4, and you're playing on turn 5 already, and you're probably going to get something pretty decent out. And then at the beginning of each of your turns is when your turn marker goes up from that point on. Jumping from turn 3 to turn 5 in one turn is it's definitely going to have an effect on the game and the way the game is played. It's really, really cool. It lets you get your guard strategy out just that much quicker, and if you're playing something like Shukaku, then it makes it much more palatable that Shukaku is such a high entrance cost ninja. Getting out of the Sand Village for a little while, we have Shino Aburame, who is a pretty decent turn 0 character from this point on. Seriously, I don't know what the deal was with Shino at the time, but lots of really great Shino cards are about to start coming out. But for right now, we have backup. If he's sent out to attack in opposed, you can just move him to a different team in any position. So you can always send him out to attack by himself, and if your opponent wastes their time trying to block his team, then he just isn't there anymore and is in a completely different team, taking battle rewards or winning battles. And if your opponent doesn't block him, then why not just take the free battle reward? I mean, his stats don't even really matter at that point, and you could do even cheesier stuff if you put him in a weapon deck, where you could get him up to 5 power to take an outstanding battle reward from your opponent when they decide not to block his team. Very fun card to play around. Of course, just like Jiraiya and Orochimaru, we have a Tsunade, who is also a turn 5 2-hand cost ninja. Win an outstanding victory or an outstanding battle reward and discard the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck. This effect is a little bit odd. I wouldn't say that it's really that good of an effect, and this is definitely one of those cards that I wouldn't mind getting rid of to just put a different Tsunade in play with a growth coin. Wind also has almost nothing to do with discarding cards from the top of your opponent's deck, so it's a pretty awkward card to try and play around if you're just going to play it for its effect. Luckily, we don't have to because we have cards like the 5th Hokage. This card would go on to lead medical decks into a brand new era in a couple of sets, so try and keep it in mind for right now. If you do have any injured ninjas in play, then she can't be sent out to attack unless you get rid of a wind chakra, but that's not really the biggest of deals. Of course, you want every chakra that you can get if you're running some kind of goddess strategy, but if you're running outside of the goddess strategies, then, I mean, you're not really going to be using your chakra for a whole lot other than getting rid of them for the 5th Hokage's attacks. Besides, if you don't have any injured ninja in play, you don't pay anything, so you could still use it in a goddess strategy just fine. Now, where the real meat and potatoes are is in her second effect. At the end of every single one of your turns, you can heal one of your injured ninja. No costs, no turn marker limits, nothing weird. It's just a straight up heal every single turn. And then once you have a field with no injured ninja, then you can start attacking without paying chakra just fine. When you growth her into play, she's a 9/2, and she has a massively good healing effect that is valid. All in all, if you're going to be growthing a Sannin into play, this is definitely the one to be doing it with. I've got one more teeny tiny jutsu that I'd like to talk about today in emergency evacuation, every ninja in the user's team becomes a standby ninja. This is a really good way to sort of just press the oh no button when your opponent does some kind of jutsu or battle trick that you're not quite ready for. Since the cost of this card is just one colorless, you can technically throw it into any deck regardless of what kind of deck you're running, and it can also be recycled with Tenten's effect if you so choose. I really wouldn't recommend it. This isn't necessarily a jutsu you want to be spamming, but when your opponent does happen to drop that lightning blade or something and you can't really deal with it, then just saying, oh no, paying 1 to turn your team back into a standby ninja, that's going to be a much better option than staying and actually taking it. This is also kind of a sneaky way to get around Vortex Jutsu, because if you use it on a ninja who is fighting against a team using Vortex Jutsu, then their effect can no longer go off because they are no longer fighting against another team. Okay, guys, it looks like I'm about out of cards here. I have one more card saved for some reason. Let me go ahead and throw that up here, see what we're working with. Konkoro Trick. When this ninja is discarded due to the showdown, you can move this ninja to its original hand instead. In that case, search for one Puppet Ninja card in your deck, input it in play, then shuffle your deck. I really don't understand why I have this card saved. Puppets... Puppets suck, right guys? I mean, there's not really anything you can do with puppets. Why am I getting so hot all of a sudden? Why is this looking at this card give me so much anxiety? Because I don't want to look at it anymore. Why would a card that clearly sucks so much give me such a panic attack? Okay, enough of that. I don't know what that was all about, but I will see you guys in the next one. I need a drink.